At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Support comes from ServiceNow. We're for people doing the creative work they actually want to do. That's why this ad was written and read by a real person and not AI. You know what people don't want to do? Boring, busy work. Now with AI agents built into the ServiceNow platform, you can automate millions of repetitive tasks in every corner of your business, IT, HR, and more, so your people can focus on the work that they want to do. That's putting AI agents to work for people. It's your turn. Visit servicenow.com.
My mother, again, because I think she thought she was the funniest person in the world, that nobody got her humor. And there are lots of things that she used to say to us that I didn't get until I was older. And one of the things she commonly said when I would ask for something, and you know, it's funny, my sister does not remember this. So I don't know if it was something she said to my sister, but she definitely said it to me. And it was, she would say, oh, you know, just ask your real parents when they come back from Europe. I'm just watching you. Or sometimes she would say, don't ask me, I just work here. And then sometimes she would, like, you know, stroke my, you know, white blonde hair and say, oh, you look just like your father. And I'd be like, Mom, Dad has red hair. And she would say, oh, not him, your real father. Like a joke. I mean, she wasn't saying it for me to believe it, but it was just it's the humor in my family anyway.
Imagine spitting into a tube, sending off your DNA, and unknowingly turning your life upside down. For me and thousands of others, this is our reality. I'm your host, Alexis Auerselt. In July of 2021, I discovered that I am an NPE, someone who has experienced a non-paternal event. In other words, my biological father isn't who I thought he was. This podcast shares the journeys of people who were shocked by a DNA discovery, mostly through modern DNA testing. We're telling the stories of NPEs, adoptees, and donor-conceived people and their families. This is DNA Surprises.
Not every DNA surprise is filled with trauma and upset. In this week's episode, Guy joins me for a delightful conversation about his NPE discovery. He discusses why he always felt like he didn't fit in and the other reasons he thought explained his outsider status in the family. He shares why he feels vindicated and relieved to learn that he is an NPE and how he's tackling his case like a detective. Thank you for sharing your story, Guy.
My name is Guy, and I'm 55, and I am from Indianapolis. Well, my DNA surprise story in a nutshell was that I discovered at this late age that the father who raised me was not my biological father. He is the biological father of my older brother and sister, but not me. My parents were together for 50 years before my mother passed away, and then he died 3 years later. There was never any suspicion that there could be other paternity other than me growing up feeling like an outsider. I always felt like, especially my father's family, I didn't look like any of them. They're all like redheads and very pale skinned. And I'm blonde with a kind of dark skin for a blonde. But the thing is, I look almost exactly like my mom. I mean, it's creepy. I mean, you look at the photographs, and she was once walking through my dorm hallway and somebody was like, oh my God, you must be Guy's mother. So I guess, although I felt alienated, I felt like I wasn't part of the group. I had no evidence to go on. But even growing up, when we would go to my father's mother's house, the only photograph she had of our family was taken before I was born. And she never had a different photograph put up. There was never a photograph of me at that house.
Did you ever ask about that?
I think I really just internalized it as a kid. I don't remember ever telling anybody about it. And I remember mentioning it to my sister just recently because of all this. And she said, oh yeah, you're right. That's true. Because there were pictures of her and my brother. They looked like members of that family. And I didn't. And I always felt that they just treated me. They weren't crazy about my mom, because my dad is from a very tiny town and came to Indianapolis to go to school. And my mother met him on a blind date. Unbeknownst to him and all of us until many years later, she was secretly putting away money to move away to California with some girlfriends. But a woman she worked with said, come and meet my boyfriend's roommate. We're going on a double date. It'll be all fun. It won't be any big deal. And mom said, he made her laugh, and that they got together, and that changed her plans. We found out later that she must have gotten pregnant really quick in their relationship, and that sort of changed everybody's plans.
Okay.
And so they got married only, I'm going to say, probably 6 months after they met. And I've heard my mother say things. She never really talked about that. I pieced that together as a kid, sitting with my grandmother, her mother, and said, wait a minute, they got married in this year, but Mindy wasn't born until this year. And my grandmother was like, yes, her mother was pregnant when she got married. Because that's how my grandmother was. She was very straightforward. She always treated me, we had a great chemistry between the two of us. And she always said that, that I just seemed like a friend of hers, even as a kid, and so she always told me this truth about stuff, which makes me think she had no idea about this. My mother's mother, my dad's family, again, they were unkind in many ways, but his mother was not warm. Let me put it that way.
Okay.
Whereas my mother's mother, was my salvation. She really was the person who made it possible for me to be the person I am today, because she just gave me so much support and so much unconditional love and so much encouragement about everything I was interested in. And also she spoke to me honestly, which is again why I think she didn't know about this, because she told me a lot of other stuff about people in the family. So anyway, they got married, she moved back with him. This would have been like 1959. They moved up back where he was from, and they lived there, where my sister was born. And then 4 years later, so my brother was born. And I knew from family stories, my mother was miserable. From her telling and her mother's telling and other family members, she felt very much not welcomed there. And that they treated, I think they had a kind of like this fancy city woman had come down and stolen one of their, homeboys, their, hometown boys. And, my mother was very beautiful and, this honey blonde Marilyn Monroe kind of figure, because she was still trying to be very feminine back then. And she was an intellectual. That's really the only way to put it. She was a deep reader. I think that she felt out of place, and she didn't really try to fit in, honestly. She always had sort of a look on her face that she knew she was the smartest person in the room. And some people gravitated toward that because they were like, oh, thank God. But other people found it off-putting. So that brings us to like 1964, my brother was born. My brother is the spit and image, as they say, of my father. Raised my father, I think is what people say, or birth certificate father. Really creepy, again, like we don't waste faces in my family. We just keep recycling them. In the family stories, I was born, and like maybe 4 months later, my dad came home from work, and my mother was packing up the station wagon, and she said, I'm taking the cats and the kids, in that order, back to Indianapolis, and you can come with us if you want. And I told that story in front of her once, years and years later, and she said, well, she laughed. She said, well, it wasn't quite that dramatic. It didn't happen exactly like that. But, the feeling was there. That's sort of what it felt like. But years later, then I heard a story from her mother. She'd come up to help my mom pack. As they were packing up the car, some neighbor ladies came over to, sort of say, oh, well, we're sorry. And my mother apparently was like, you gossipy old biddies. That's not the word she used. Sure. Get your ass back over and stay out of everybody's business. And my grandmother was shocked, because that's not how my mother would. She was raised as a Southern lady with manners. And my mom was like, they know what they're doing. They're just over here to gossip, and I'm not having it. I'm getting out of this town. So she was not happy there. Fast forward to them moving to Indianapolis, in the big city. And my brother and sister never stopped talking about the idyllic life they had led in this small town. And growing up, it really did feel like they were kids who were raised in the country versus me, who grew up in the city. Now, Indianapolis is not a huge, sophisticated city, but compared to the rest of Indiana, it sure is.
How much older are your older siblings than you?
My sister is 7 years older, and my brother is 3 years older.
Okay.
So by the time I came around, they had been married about 7 years. And mom had been living in this small town for about 7 years. And I think it was hard for them. Even my brother, who was he would have been 3 when they moved. I think that transition was tough for them because, it was just a whole new house. And I have no memory of that small town. I have no memory of until we moved into this house, but growing up, again, I always felt like an outsider. And my mother didn't help things by dyeing her hair like a dark red throughout my whole childhood. So even in our family photos, it's like these 4 dark-haired people, and two redheads, and there's my huge, enormous blonde head that just looks like I also had my head was adult size as a child, and so I'm no matter where, my head is taking up the room. And then all the photographs of my cousins from my dad's side, I look like a neighbor kid who's just dropped in because I just don't fit in at all. So, I grew up very much not part of this family's culture, but very much embraced by my mother's family because I look like her and they were very fond of her. And also very much encouraged by my grandmother to be an original person, to be follow my own drumbeat. And she liked that about me. Because I think she had been sort of what she called it, avant-garde person, as a teen in the 30s. And so, look, I was a teen in the 80s, and, I looked like a blonde Boy George.
Oh, that's amazing.
So look him up if you're young to know who he was. And my gender variance was always there. I played with dolls I have no memory of not playing with dolls. And my mother, because she was a feminist, encouraged it and allowed it, and defended me from family members who would try to shame me for it. And my grandmother, I think that came from my grandmother, because I think my grandmother was very much let him be who he is, and I think also, I'll be honest with you, my mother enjoyed the cachet of having a child who wasn't like the rest of her children, the rest of the kids, that he was clearly artistic, and I think that she dined out on that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think she enjoyed the how that made her special as a mom. It reflected on her.
Yeah.
Up to a point.
Okay.
I think after a certain age, it became she joined in with the rest of the grown-ups who feared what that was a signal of. That what that would foretell. And I think it began to make her uncomfortable, because I think she struggled with her own gender for so long that she did not feel feminine, and she hated being tiny and dainty and being put in this little box because of being blonde and being, barely 5 feet tall and this treated like a doll.
Yeah.
And so she really rebelled against that during my childhood. I see her in pictures with my brother and sister, and she's still, makeup and beautiful clothing. And then the pictures with me, she's got this butch haircut and these pantsuits. And one of the stories that my mother used to tell is about taking me to something at my school, and one of the kids saying, "Excuse me, sir, whose daddy are you?"
Yeah.
And I think, again, she sort of enjoyed that.
How did your father treat you and her?
I'll tell you this. I had friends in high school who thought my father was deaf, because they would come over and he would never say a word, or he would pick us up someplace and take us someplace and he never said a word. And I never spoke to him and he never spoke to me. And another friend kind of was worried that maybe my father was dead because I never talked about it. And that's not an inaccurate way to place it, because he never spoke. He was a very quiet person, very buttoned up. In hindsight, I see that both of them suffered from depression.
Yeah.
And a lot of untreated stuff that I think their lives would have been a lot happier, frankly. They were not happy people. Sometimes they were fun people. They weren't happy.
Yeah.
So he didn't get in my way.
Okay.
And I think that was because my mother wouldn't let him and my grandmother wouldn't let him. But he never, every time I would leave the house, he would make the same joke going to a costume party. But and that's passive aggressive and a
Yeah.
microaggression.
Yes.
But he also didn't say, get back in there and take that makeup off.
Right. Okay.
But I did grow up with this feeling of feeling like an outsider, which at the time, growing up, I thought was really about being gay. I thought it was that from a very young age, I had a secret. And until puberty hit, the secret was that I played with dolls. And that was something shameful that people couldn't know outside of the family.
Mm.
And then when I, hit puberty, that turned into, oh, this is something else. My outsider status is something else within this family. And being an outsider in a group, you have a view of the family that's different than the insiders do.
Yeah.
Any minority group or historically disenfranchised group has that experience. Although women are not minorities, they still are disenfranchised from this society, and so they have a different perspective of it than men do. And men don't even get that there can be a different way of seeing the world.
Right.
Often.
Right.
My perspective is skewed because although I don't consider myself non-binary, when I was growing up, I'm so old now that we said androgynous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which meant being both male and taking the best of both.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how I sort of felt, once I kind of integrated my personality. It was like, oh, I'm feminine and masculine, and that's fine with me.
Yeah.
It's not that simple, of course, but so that just sort of made sense to me that, those are the reasons I'm not part of this family. Mm-hmm. And that the grownups who have felt alienated from me or couldn't relate to me, that was why. Because that, they were uncomfortable with my gayness. And the fact that I also wasn't like a quiet, closeted gay kid, I was pretty out there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's so interesting how often with NPE stories, we hear some other difference that we attributed our outsider feeling to, whether it's, I was the outspoken one, or I was the one who was gay, or whatever the reason, we're usually pointing at something else other than I'm not genetically linked to half of this family, right?
It's fascinating, isn't it? And you can't help but wonder, that whole argument about nature and nurture, of course, is specious, because it's really, those two things are not separate. They are so ingrained, you can't pull them apart. But what I wonder is, I read once this theory about why often gay men are alienated from their fathers. And it's not necessarily that they, as gay people, young gay people, have done anything that makes their father not like them, but their father senses that. Even if their father doesn't know yet, their father senses that there's something that separates them. Mm. And I wonder if that's true, especially in family situations where at least one of the parents knew, if there was a sense that this kid is not one of us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they may not even be conscious of
right.
it, but they treat that kid slightly different. And of course, it's a lie when any parent says, oh, I treated you all the same. Well, of course you did, because you were a different parent at 20 than you were at 27.
Right.
I mean, of course you were.
And your children are different people with different needs.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I look at the three of us in my family, and that we grew up in the same environment, literally the same house for our whole childhoods. And, our parents were married that whole time, but we couldn't be more different. My brother and sister are much more alike culturally. But again, having a sense of being an outsider at such a young age, I was probably drawn to things that helped me understand my outsider identity that they didn't have to do.
Right.
That's why I said, when you asked me how I was doing with this news, that I felt liberated, that I felt let out of jail, and I felt let off the hook. Because I realized I had been carrying, no matter how proud I had claimed to be, and how the story of my sexuality is so different from many other people I know who faced much more horrifying treatment from their parents and estrangement, or people who chose estrangement just to ghost their family, to not deal with it. And I didn't have that. I mean, I didn't, my parents were not going to PFLAG meetings, but they also weren't casting me out of the family.
Yeah, it sounds like they were doing maybe the best that they could at the time with what they had.
Yes, people can't give you what they don't have.
Yeah. And
they didn't have, as far as I know, any gay friends. So when I guess technically came out to my parents would have been, 1987. That's not a time when they had any images in pop culture to in any way understand. And also, there were so few that they had no idea that there could be all kinds of different people, that there was no such thing as a gay,
right, right. It's not a monolith by any means.
Exactly. That's the whole thing I'm so grateful now that we talk about, is that, when you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. In the same way with all groups, is that you can't let one person be the totem for everybody in that who shares that experience.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, I just sort of accepted that I was never really gonna feel part of this family, and I'd made my peace to a large degree with that. I'd made my peace that it was never gonna feel great, and the whole idea of like, does this bring me joy? Oh my God, joy to me is like an ecstatic feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not aiming for joy. I'm not even aiming for happiness. I'm aiming for the absence of pain. And I think that's sort of how I came to my being comfortable with my alienation from with my family, is that it didn't bring me pain anymore. I accepted that it was never going to bring me a great comforting feeling. So, that was fine. I moved back here after many, many years in New York to work in theater here. And when I turned 40, and I was living with my parents when I first moved back, because it was also, like 2008 when the economy I could not have picked a better time to leave New York, because I shudder to think of how I would have been surviving back then.
Yeah.
So I was living with my parents, it's an enormous house. I had the whole top floor to myself. And my mother did often say to me, no offense to my brother and sister, I was the one that they would be willing to live with, because I guess because I left so early, because I moved out when I was, I moved to New York at 19. So I left. And then like literally a year after I moved back, my mother was diagnosed with cancer and given 3 months. And honestly, by the time she was diagnosed, because it was brain cancer, she was gone. I mean, she was conscious and functioning for maybe another month or so, but she'd had a stroke from the cancer, and it did damage her language a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so she wasn't able to really talk to us. She could do some writing, but it wasn't really legible. And so she really was kind of gone from that moment.
Wow.
Which made her death actually a lot easier, because we had this 3 month, and it was really like they gave her 3 months and it was like to the day. And that was all okay. That was, we made I think each of us dealt with that in a different way. I used to, accuse her of me being an accident. And she said, no, I had you on purpose, and I wanted one more. Because I was like, why did you bother? You had a boy, you had a girl. Why didn't you just stop there? And she said, well, because I had one kid for my family and one kid for his family, and I wanted the one that was just for me.
Oh, interesting.
Which, of course, in this new,
Yeah,
with the information we have now, that's a very telling story, right?
it is. So what made you take a DNA test to begin with?
Well, my sister had been in contact with our cousins on my dad's side. And the cousin on her dad's side, had started doing all of this research on the family, but she was learning all this new stuff about it. And Mindy was getting really interested in it, my sister. And she took her test, and it was interesting to hear her results of things that she found out. And, but I never really had a lot of interest in it, honestly. I have a weird face that people would always like, where are you from? What is your background? Because for my coloring, I have strangely shaped eyes, and it wasn't until I moved to New York, I met a lot of Ukrainian people, that the ladies that I worked with would say, oh, you must be Ukrainian. I was like, well, I don't know that I have any Ukrainian. And no, you look just like my granddaughter. And then I would meet people from Ukraine, and they all were like blonde and blue eyed. And then when I went to Europe for the first time, people just would speak to me in German or, Swedish, and they just assumed. And so I did sort of wonder about that. And there had been sort of a legend from my mother's side of the family, from my mother. She had sort of done some research that she thought that her father's family, because they're the ones that we look so much like, had come from Russia, and that they were Jews that had escaped Russia. There's no real evidence of that. This is her theory.
Okay.
So I thought, well, maybe that's true. Maybe, I mean, I look like them, I look like, and, even Jewish people in New York, Hasidic people would stop me and say, oh, are you Jewish? And I was like, no. And like, well, you must, it was very strange. So I started thinking, okay, well, maybe that's why that explains the otherness is that, it's just a gene that got handed to me. So anyway, Mindy wanted to find out. And so at Christmas this last year, she bought for me and my niece and my nephew. Neither my sister and I have children, but my brother had kids. And he's not part of our family anymore, but Mindy and I sort of, have taken them on, yeah, it's our default children, frankly. And so she bought them for the three of us. And my nephew and niece, her brother and sister, took theirs pretty quickly and compared their results, which they thought was so interesting that one of them was a little bit more Irish than the other. And, it was just an interesting story, but nothing they discovered. And I just couldn't get around to doing it. I kept forgetting about it. And frankly, also, I take so many medications that dry my mouth that I was dreading having to come up with enough saliva to fill that too. But finally, I was like, okay, finally, I'll do it. So I don't know, sometime in April, I did it around my birthday, I guess. Shipped it off, and I really didn't think much about it. But the thing that's interesting is that this Ukrainian Jew thing had become sort of a backstory for me to sort of explain, these are the people I come from. Maybe that it's, and I kind of really was drawn to the culture. And I thought, well, I have a really Russian personality, just these ridiculous, again, that whole confirmation bias thing, and I would look at pictures of Russian people specifically, well, actually not Russian, but, now that Ukraine hopefully remains its own country. And I think, oh yeah, you know what? I do look like them. Mm-hmm. So when I got the results back, finally, my niece and nephew and my sister and my nephew's wife, we all share a text chain. It was like the week before Father's Day. And it was later in the evening, not 9:30 or so. And so I was sending them screenshots of my results saying, because the devastating news that I saw in it was that I was not at all Ukrainian or Russian. And although my sister and my nephew and niece had, I don't know, like 2 or 3% European Jewish background, I had none at all, that I was not even really that German, that I was like 50% English and Scottish. And so I'm texting them, I'm like, how on earth did I end up being the whitest person in this family? It is unfair and unjust. How can I just be English? That is wrong. I was willing to accept at least being German. That has some flavor. But the thought of just being plain old English, and the other thing about this is so ridiculous is growing up, the bicentennial happened when I was 9. And so I was deeply in love with all things about the Revolutionary War. And I had a weird patriotism that some people are sometimes sort of surprised. I call myself a James Baldwin patriot in that, I love this country so much, which is why I feel I have a duty to ensure that it holds up its standards. Yeah. And sometimes people mistake that for not being, go USA. Of course I am, but I want it to be everything it can be. Right. And so again, people are sometimes surprised by my love of Revolutionary War history and all of that. My bedroom as a child was decorated in all revolutionary, very frankly, hunky, sexy Revolutionary War soldiers. And anyway, so again, I was appalled.
You wanted something a little more interesting.
Yes. I felt like, you know what? I felt like genetically I deserved it. And so I'm really just joking this way with the family, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm sending them the what it says. And my nephew's like, okay, but it says that Aunt Mindy is like 99% likely to be your grandchild or grandmother, or like a half sibling. And then it said, look, do you see mine? Because they sent me screenshots of theirs, and it said that you're my half uncle. And I was just joking at that point. I was like, half uncle? What even does that mean? I wasn't getting it. I mean, the chain is, like several bits of dialogue of them trying to get me to see what's before me. I did not see it. I wasn't looking for it. And so finally they were like, dude, grandpa is not your dad.
Wow.
And I was like, what? And I really did keep looking at it going, what? I mean, but again, it instantly made sense. I did not expect to find that news out, but it made total sense. It just made total sense. Now, there was a whole backstory that I couldn't put together, but the feeling made sense. And even in that evening, as I was going to sleep, I felt something, I'm not a very spiritual person, but I did feel a weight lift off me.
Yeah.
And the weight that I felt lift off me was my mother has still been present in my life. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but she's still been here. And I talk about her a lot. And there are times when I miss her. I mean, she was a pain in the ass, but she was a genuine person, like a full 3D person that you could never stop talking about for the rest of your life. And she's so interesting. She's such a fascinating story. I've never missed my father, the man who raised me. I never think about him. I don't have any fond memories of him. And I felt guilty about that, especially living in essentially his house. And which he did not leave to me, by the way. I had to buy it from the estate. There's a whole lot of economic aspects to this, of things that my parents did for other children in the family that they did not do for me, that I kind of just always told myself, oh, well, they need it more. I'm, in New York and all this stuff. But of course, again, this new lens does make me think, what was that about?
Did someone know something? So did you have any matches that were not matched with your sister?
Yes, I did. And that was the next day. My sister came over because the other layer of this, my mother's best friend, who she's known since junior high, they became friends again living up in this small town. They randomly ran into each other. They'd lost contact after high school. They randomly ran into each other. They were, of course, then thrilled to find each other in these small towns. And they spent as much time as they could together. Our family sort of blended. We called them our aunt and our cousins. She had stair-step kids between my mothers. I'd always heard a story, versions of a story, of how my cousin Karen and I are the youngest, and we're months apart. So, they had been friends, but they became really, like sisters, and they called each other sister. And her youngest, my aunt's youngest, and I grew up very close to one another, more than cousins, really, even like brother and sister. So my aunt, and I just saw her, I don't know, a couple of years ago. I went to visit her, and she told a story about how they came to have the two of us. And it was sort of linked up with my mother's story about deciding to have one for herself. But what she said was that, mind you, this would have been like early 66. Apparently, my mother wanted to stay on a birth control. It was a new birth control that her doctor was giving her. And it was coming to a point where she had to be off of it for 3 months. And she begged him to not do that because she said, I will immediately get pregnant. Because apparently she got pregnant very fast, but he had to take her off of it. And she was pissed about it. She said, then, I want to have my tubes tied. And he wouldn't let her because she was only 26 at the time and in 66. But I thought that was too young to, for a woman to make that. And also she would have had to have my dad's signature to get it done.
Of course.
And so she was pissed. And she stopped at my aunt's house, and who was also just coming from a situation where she was trying to divorce her husband, who had been playing around on her the whole time, and was being basically told by their church, you can't do that. And so she was also not really happy right then. Apparently they commiserated, and my aunt said to my mom, you know what, let's do? We'll each have one more, and then we'll be done. That'll be it. And so that's the story that they always told about how we became the ones that they were having just for us.
Okay.
Of course, now that story takes on a whole different light because it makes me think, yes, my mother would be the kind of person who'd be like, screw you. I can't get out of this marriage, but you can't control my uterus. And so I can have a baby. I can, go have a baby with anybody I want to. Whether that was true, whether that was a conscious decision on her part, obviously we'll never know that.
Yeah.
But she definitely is somebody who would be like, ha ha ha, you have all the power, but this is the power that I have.
Right.
It was a very big deal, like in many ways. That's, again, part of the lore. The next day, my sister comes over and says that she has called my cousin immediately because growing up, that had been rumored. Somehow, even growing up, we had all heard rumors that possibly, eventually my aunt did get divorced, but we had heard that, there were some rumors that a certain guy was really her father, but never confirmed. I don't think that she and her mother ever talked about it. So I don't really even know now how we knew that, but it was one of those things that you know in a family.
Yeah.
And I think that my cousin just didn't really ever pursue it because she didn't think that there was anything for her to get from it. My sister called my cousin immediately and was like, okay, this is what we just found out. My cousin was like, all right, I'll go take the test then. And also she called her mother and she said, look, guy just found out this news. So he's going to want to talk to you. But apparently my aunt said, all right, well, tell him to call me and I'll tell him what I know, which was the first time that I was really like, oh, okay, then this is real.
And somebody knows something.
Yeah. But the next day, my sister came over and tells me the story. And I'm sharing with her the names that did come up. And I say one of them, she goes, oh my God, I know that name. There was somebody with that name who would come over and that, she remembered. My sister was only 6, so she didn't remember a lot about it.
Yeah.
And so that really did strike her a little, I think, that we had a suspect, as we've been calling it in my family.
Mm-hmm.
And my family, again, my niece and nephew, all of them have been very much of like, how you doing with this? And how are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, I feel fine. I'm embarrassed that I'm not undone by this. I'm actually put back together by this, frankly. So we went to see my aunt, and, she's getting older, and I think, hard to keep her on the track. And it took a long time to get her to where she finally sort of made up an excuse to get her husband out of the room with my sister. And she really didn't want to talk about it. And she told me that my mother had once said to her, when I'm gone, don't tell anybody about our misadventures. That's how she put it. I think my aunt was figuring out how to talk about it in a way that she didn't also have to talk about things that she'd put behind her in her own life. The biggest worry that I had in talking to my aunt was, am I going to find out that this was not a consensual situation? It was the only thing that I really thought, this will be hard. And how will I find a way to honor my mother's story there? And that's the thing I was most worried about, frankly. But no, my aunt assured me, because she asked me about the name that Mindy recognized. And she said, yes, that would be the guy. And I said, well, can you tell me a little bit? And she said, well, it's a small town gossip. And all these busybodies were always trying to cause scandal. And they were, she said there were these 2 guys who were just trying to protect them. They were always around. They were just trying to protect them, meaning my mother and my aunt. And I was like, well, what do you mean by protect you? Get us out of situations that, we might find ourselves in where, people gossip about us. I was like, okay, but I didn't say this to her, but I was like, clearly there was something behind that gossip. The only thing she really gave me was, your mother and I were as close as sisters, but your mother still kept stuff from me. There were still things your mother didn't tell me. Now, whether that's true or not, I can't judge. It sounds like her. I completely can buy her having a soulmate friend, that there was still stuff she kept from her. So that's as much information as I could really get from my aunt.
So you kind of, you get confirmation that yes, that name, that's somebody that we did associate with, that probably would be it, but I don't know the exact circumstances under which you were conceived.
I've been viewing this all as an investigation in terms of what evidence can I really bring to the judge to make a case. And so there's a known associate. He was in the right place at the right time. And then when I said, well, it's pretty likely that my conception would have happened around 4th of July of 1966. And she had sort of a reaction to that. But she didn't really go into it. She's just like, yeah, okay, yeah, I can see that. And she kind of got distracted by talking about her own running around, but not actually admitting it. And she did sort of talk. She knew her daughter was having this test, and she knew that and she said, well, and I know who it would be. And she said, well, they were best friends and they worked together and they hung out together. So these 2 guys seemed like prime suspects. It wasn't really helpful, but I got the most important thing I got from her was acknowledgement that, as far as she knew, it would have been a consensual situation, because mom apparently did have some kind of relationship with him.
Okay.
But she didn't give any more than that. Then she got a phone call, and it was going on and on. And so I was like, I'm going to go. And she said, but we're good, right? We're good. And I said, well, yeah, I mean, if I have any other questions, I'll let you know. And she said, oh God, don't make me go through this again.
Mm.
And then she was like, oh, but I guess I'm going to have to if the test comes back with, and cut to, a couple, like last week sometime, my cousin got her results back. And we were actually sort of kind of secretly hoping that it would be the same person.
Yeah.
Because we thought, that'd be fun.
Be siblings. Yeah.
Exactly. And we were fine with it because we already felt like brother and sister anyway, but it would have just been a little bow on this bizarre story. But hers did turn out to be the guy that had always been rumored to be her father.
So she's also an NPE.
Yeah. And so she's at the really beginning of this. In fact, she and I are going to talk about that. We're going to chat later. It is fascinating, these two women who are best friends. So it does sort of sound intentional, doesn't it? It's so weird. I mean, It may just be just a coincidence. But they both, got pregnant with other men who were best friends.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. My family now started researching this suspect and trying to find connections and everything and pictures of him. And they're all like, but look at this picture. Those look like your hands. And then it turns out, so apparently this person passed away a handful of years ago, let's say.
Okay.
Still living in that small town, but he was married that whole time. And he has kids that are right around me. I would have been in school with those kids. I can't help but thinking, is part of that story that mom got the hell out of town before I grew old enough to look like all of his kids?
Oh, that's because
that would have been a whole other funny, right?
Yeah.
But then when I told my best friend about all of this, I mean, she understood everything immediately. It was amazing. But what she said to me is, because we were trying to figure out, why didn't they tell me? Did dad know? Is the way he treated me because he knew? Or is it just that, he really just didn't like me?
Yeah.
And which answer do you want? But she said this, and I never thought about this. And she said, but your mother couldn't have known. There was no paternity test that she could have taken. There was no, unless, your father was away at war, during your conception, which wasn't true. He was right there. They were living together and having, one assumes, a sexual relationship. So it's very possible that she had no idea.
Right. Or it was a possibility, but it wasn't.
It was a possibility.
Right.
And, my father worked a job in which he came in contact with probably at least half of the population of this tiny town, and an environment where people came and, would shoot the shit. Hard to believe that if there were rumors that he didn't hear them.
Right.
But again, that's circumstantial. We don't know that.
That kind of supports your theory, though. You were a baby, and she's like, we're leaving. We're out of here.
Even the idea that she was, drummed out of town, kind of, because my mother would not have been like, I'm going to stay here and put up with this. No, she would have been like, I'm out of here. Forget it. Because she used to say, God made the world, man made the city, but the devil made the small town.
Wow.
Right? Again, makes so much sense, right?
And her hatred for the gossipy women and
and then when we would go up there every other weekend to visit my dad's family, my mother hated it. I hated it too. It was a miserable experience for me because his father would call me sissy every time he was awful. And, no grown-up ever stopped him, because they were such passive people. And I have a vivid memory of refusing to get out of the car for an entire day when we went to visit there. It was just so torturous for a child to go through that.
Yeah. So you kind of had I don't want to say luxury, but you had the fortune of quickly identifying who your bio father is.
In theory.
Okay. In theory.
Here's what I keep saying to my family, because they're all ready for this to be, again, that confirmation bias where they think they see, similarities. And even I've seen pictures of, there aren't a lot, but I've seen pictures of him from high school, and I can go, well, I can see it, and I've seen pictures of his kids online, and I'm like, it would not be hard to believe that these were my siblings, though. If you see the ones I grew up with, you would be like, you're not related.
But you are genetically related to some of his genetic relatives, correct?
Yes, that's what we know. I'm related. All I can see is I'm related to a second cousin. There's a second cousin who is a close enough match to be my second cousin. but none of his immediate family comes up. Now, that's, of course, a part of the problem with Ancestry and all those other websites. It's only people who've done the test.
Right. So you've narrowed it down. You have a prime suspect, as you say, but you don't have 100% confirmed.
Yes, because all that proves is that I am related to somebody who is related to that person.
Okay. Have you connected with that relative?
Yeah, that's the next step, right? I have not, because I have not come to a decision. Well, I clearly actually have come to a decision. I haven't decided to say that I decided this, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
The big thing I keep talking about with my family and in therapy is I don't believe at this point there's anything that I can benefit from knowing one way or the other that would outweigh the potential for harm to that family. You know, he's gone. The son died a few years later, and the mother's still alive. She's not an old lady. I mean, she's, and I just feel like, what's the point of coming in here now? I don't know that I could really ever. And there's another part of me that thinks it's terrible, but I think the devil you know is sometimes better than the devil you don't. And I'd rather deal with the memories of growing up with this difficult father than find out this person I can't ever know might have been somebody who would have been even worse. It's a small town. They never left that small town. So, the likelihood of them being part of that's not fair. That's a prejudice I know that I share about that provincial world, but there's reasons for it.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I want to find that out. I don't want to find out. I'm afraid of what I might find out. But more than that, I don't know that I have the right. You know what I mean? I don't know that I have. I mean, if it was somebody else, I would say, well, of course you have a right. It's your family and whatever. But I'm not at risk for anything. There's no inheritance at stake. It's not like I have to claim my birthright so the castle doesn't get foreclosed on. You know what I mean? And I'm old enough that I don't have children, so there aren't people that would value knowing this, or get grandchildren that family, those sisters would get to know as their nieces and nephews. That's not really part of it. Now, of course, because my sister and I talked about this, if somebody came to us and was like, I think your dad, we would be like, oh my God, yes. And we would, because that's how we are. It would be like, oh, that's a surprise. But we would immediately embrace that person into the family because that's just how we are. We're like the blob. We just, take people into the family and they never get to leave. I mean that in a nice way, that's just how we are. We welcome people, but I don't want to risk these people finding out something that would shake their memories of somebody. And maybe it wouldn't. We don't know that. We don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like you want that confirmation that this is your biological father, or are you at peace with?
No. It's not because if I don't know, it's not real. That's not it at all. It's that I don't need to know anything else, because it's like not having a father at all.
This episode is brought to you by Peacock. The new Peacock original documentary, Matthew Perry, A Hollywood Tragedy, dives deep into the beloved actor's rise to fame and his tragic death. 5 people, including Perry's personal assistant, 2 medical doctors, and an alleged Hollywood drug dealer known as the Ketamine Queen, were charged with conspiracy to illegally provide Perry with the ketamine. Explore the details of the case in this heartbreaking special, streaming now only on Peacock.
This episode is brought to you by Honda. Introducing the all-new, all-terrain Honda Passport Trail Sport, the most off-road capable Honda Passport Honda has ever dreamt up. The Passport features increased ground clearance, roof rails on all trims, and available specially developed all-terrain tires. And you'll stay comfortable with tri-zone climate control and available features like heated and ventilated front seats and a panoramic moonroof. Learn more at honda.com/passport.
And in fact, my therapist even said to me, well, you sort of raised yourself, didn't you? And I was like, well, yeah, I guess. So really, who I am is really, my fault completely. So, but I'm fine with that.
But I think that's such an interesting perspective to just kind of weigh the risks versus the benefits and kind of land with, you're good with what you know at this point. Is there anything else that you want to know?
I don't know. If I were younger, it might be different. If I was younger, I think I would have a fantasy. And my therapist did even ask me this, and something I hadn't thought about. Like, well, what was my fantasy growing up of what kind of father I would like to have had? And I knew immediately it was like, TV fathers that I do remember having that feeling of watching certain shows, Family Affair, things that are way before your time, but, that oftentimes had single men raising children, Courtship of Betty's Father. And I know I had a crush at a very young age on Bill Bixby. And it was not a romantic crush. It was like a dad crush.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted him to be my dad.
Yeah.
Because, I would see people with their parents, friends, and even other relatives, and their parents were so demonstrative and so affectionate with them in a way I could never imagine my parents being. And in a way that I thought, wait a minute, is that what having a father is like? And it really did kind of throw me for a loop of like, there are people who love their father.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was surprising to me.
How has this revelation changed your view of your mother and father?
It not only lets me off the hook, I don't have to feel like I was a disappointment. I don't have to feel like that I owed them anything.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think that's how I grew up feeling. And that's why I got out of the house so young. And it's why I never took money from them. It's because I felt like I had broken the pact. That by being gay, and not just any old gay, but being, a feminine gay person who wore makeup and you didn't hide it. I wasn't a closeted person, which I could have had the decency to at least do that. But I wasn't. But I left town so they didn't have to deal with it. I always felt like, well, I don't deserve that sort of stuff because I broke the rules. So if you don't like the rules of a club, then you don't get to be in that club. That's all there is to it. The club gets to make the rules. Now, none of this was ever spoken. This is what I intuited as a child. But I felt when I found this out, I was like, wait a minute. Okay, I didn't break the rules. Or even if I did, I owe you nothing. Because,
Yeah.
You ain't in charge of me. And then even thinking that he knew that, in a way, I kind of think it lets him off the hook too. Because if that's true, if he knew about it or even suspected, I mean, that's got to be hard.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think there are a lot of people out there who are that generous. I'm so grateful that I was raised not by my parents, although they were funny. They were funny in a dark sort of way. My grandmother, though, was so funny, my mom's mom. And the thing she taught me so much was life is real and it's happening. And so you might as well, she used to say, it is what it is, but you might as well find something funny in it. It's not going to make you not have had a stroke. It's not going to make you not have, by worrying and kvetching and crying about it. So you might as well find the humor in it. Because, and Carrie Fisher once said, my life has to be funny or else it would just be true. And I think that that's something that has guided me and made me able to joke about this. And if I'd found this out at a younger time, I think it would have made me think I could have a relationship with a father that I'd never had. And I don't know if that's possible. When you fantasize about, this loving figure that would have supported you, nobody has that really. And even the people that loved, their fathers, kids and parents have difficult relationships regardless.
Yes.
Yeah.
Families are complicated.
Yeah, exactly. And so for me, I feel like my father, I have let off the hook. It doesn't change any kind of affection for him, but it does make me think, okay, well, you know what? Again, people can't give you what they don't have. And if I was a constant reminder of like the worst part of his marriage, I think he did a really amazing job not being worse to me, honestly. There's a Cinderella movie called Ever After. Is that what it is, with Drew Barrymore?
Yeah.
And she says to her stepmother, Angelica Houston, was there ever a moment when you really loved me? And Angelica Houston says, how can you love a pebble in your shoe?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say that I think he did a great job, if he did know, not taking that out on me more.
Yeah.
So in many ways, I'm sort of like, okay, you're done. You can go on. And I don't feel bad about not missing you or feeling nostalgic for you. So I feel like that's just sort of done. With my mother, it's more complicated. With my mother, it's like, I didn't need one more thing to make you a full, rich person. You were already complicated enough.
Mm-hmm.
And now I will never know what that story is. I will never know, was this actually like a real true love of her life? Was this just a fun affair? And there's no way to ever know that. And that's fine. It makes me actually more sympathetic to her, because I think I did, after she died, feel like, why couldn't you have been more loving? Why couldn't you have been more supportive? But who knows, did I actually remind her of this period of her life that she felt bad about, or that she felt guilty about, or, or did she just not even think about it? Did she think it would never come out? I don't know. I do wonder.
Yeah.
But I do have affection for her in a different way now, in that I think, wow, that must have been tough to not know. And I think, well, why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she ever let me know? I think she didn't think it was worth the risk. I think, honestly, I think that she thought that it's very unlikely that it would ever come out.
Right.
And we've all talked about, what if we had taken this test while she was alive? I think she would have lied. I actually think she would have said, well, that's just not true. I don't think she would. She left no diary. She left no letters. She left nothing. I know people that she had correspondence with. I don't know if she burned it all. I don't know what. I don't know. Nobody's come forth with any kind of, oh, I wanted to share this, lovely letter from. I'm like probably the only person in the world who has a box of letters from her. So I don't know. I think it makes me more affectionate toward her in a way that I'm surprised to find out.
Yeah.
Because I think that she was not a happy person. And it makes me feel like, was this some moment of happiness for her? Was this a time that there was some pleasure that she could make her own and make a private thing and make, in this, like this little oasis? And it may not have been perfect, and she may have felt guilty about, or she may not have. She may not have given a second thought to the consequences. It's so hard to know.
Much. Yeah, it's like you'll never know.
So I don't know. I do feel fonder of her, oddly.
I do just have to observe, it's interesting that you're so into like Revolutionary War history, and then you were conceived around July 4th. I think that's really funny.
Yeah, I didn't even put that together. That's the first time I've ever said. That's hilarious.
So funny.
That is funny. Also, I'm a costume designer, so I've studied costume history, and it's just
that's so funny. So what's next for you then? You're at peace for now without, reaching out. What's next for your journey?
I will say that I keep going back to, I paid for the deluxe membership, and I've still learned nothing extra. It's really, and I don't know what I'm looking for. I'm looking for, when I keep going back to the app, that maybe one of those relatives would join on, and I would find some connection. And I've heard stories of people contacting distant cousins, and that's the way they kind of do that. It wouldn't probably take too much to basically, I'm probably one person removed. That's such a small town, that I'm probably 2 phone calls away from being in contact with his family. I don't know if it's worth it. I don't know that what they could gain, as I said earlier, from finding, maybe, who knows? There's a whole other novel here where his marriage was miserable, and they loved their dad, and they would love to find out that there was something that he loved in his life. Or, maybe they've all known that they had this rift early in their marriage, and that they lived under the specter. It ruined their whole childhood because of the way it affected their parents.
Yeah.
So again, I got no dog in that race. I had nothing to do with it. I didn't cause it. I used to tell people years ago, I thought of this analogy of why I didn't really fit in. I said, well, look, I don't blame them for it. I was a hippopotamus that was dropped off in a group of giraffes. They did the best they could, but they were never going to really turn me into a giraffe, and they had no idea how to raise a hippopotamus.
Yeah.
And so I can't blame them for that. That's not their fault. They took me in, and I'm grateful for that. The way this has changed is I don't have to feel so grateful anymore. What I mean by that is that I think I grew up with this sense that I was like this orphan who should be grateful that he is given, the nook under the stairs. And now I don't feel that way. Now I feel liberated. So I don't know that there's anything I need to do about it, because I feel kind of like don't have the burden of paternity on me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And that's good. I mean, look, it's still weird. It still makes me think I still have a lot of investigation of looking through, like, to me, because of who I am, I'm going to take a little time going through every moment of my life and seeing it through this new lens.
Yeah.
Because it does change. My sister, she kept saying, well, nothing, it doesn't change anything. It doesn't change anything. And she's like, I'm sorry I even got that test. And I was like, but it does change everything. It doesn't change anything between us, but it changes everything for me. And I think what for next step for me is trying to help my family understand what that feels like. I'm not sure I need confirmation. In fact, the fun of it might kind of disappear a little bit if I knew exactly who it was. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Now I can kind of just imagine it. And, when we were first playing with this, I had all these celebrities that could have, from 1966. Okay, who is my mother's type? This guy, Donald Sutherland. Yeah, he's a real prime suspect here. And I mean, again, I think it's an interesting story that becomes more interesting when it doesn't have finality to the story.
Mm-hmm.
For me, at least.
Yeah.
I'm comfortable with not knowing. It's how I feel about any kind of spiritual thing. Is I'm not going to deny anything. There are things that don't really, I'm not interested in, and they don't affect me in any way in terms of spirituality. But I'm sort of like, well, I can never know the answer to this, and I'm cool with that. So, and that's kind of how I feel about this. It's like, I ain't never going to know. It's highly unlikely. Everybody that could tell anything is gone. So just make your peace with not knowing.
I really like that perspective. So what advice would you offer a parent who may be keeping a DNA surprise from their child?
Golly, it's so particular, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that there are great reasons that a parent might want to not share that. And that I think you would have to weigh what the benefit to your child is versus what the damage it might be for you. Because I do think that, yes, it's the child's life and their right to know these sort of things, but becoming a parent is never simple. And I'm not a parent myself, but I watch everyone in my family and all my friends deal with parenthood, and some choose it and some it's haphazardly happens. And every baby seems like a bad idea at the time, and then turns out to be an amazing, you can't imagine your family without them. Mm-hmm. And my grandmother used to say, if people waited until it was a good time to have a baby, no one would have babies. So I don't know. I think you have to decide, what's this going to be like if she finds out and I didn't tell her? Because I think that's the part. It's not the truth that it ain't the crime, it's the cover up.
That's right.
It's the Watergate rule. And I think that's what you have to examine. Do I want to deal with the consequences of telling her this now? Or do I want 20 years from now to explain why I lied to her, why I fabricated all of this? And I think that's an individual choice. Look, if you're like my mom and you think, I can ride this through, ain't nobody gonna know about this, then, go ahead and you're scot-free.
But now with
but
DNA
I think you would
tests,
also,
probably not.
That's really what I would say is, look, you ain't gonna be able to keep that secret anymore. It's gonna come out. Mm-hmm. And, my grandmother used to always say that sunshine is the best antiseptic. Get the story out now. I would say get in front of the story, be the one to tell your kid instead of your kid coming to you and saying, is something you want to share with me?
Yeah.
So I guess I would say ultimately, yeah, you should tell your kid, unless there are situations where revealing that truth is going to cause harm to you or to your child. There are certainly people in situations where they could be really at risk.
Yeah,
for
that's a good point. Through. It is very nuanced.
It's like when you tell people, like, everybody should come out of the closet. Well, not everybody has that luxury.
Yeah.
Not everybody is safe. It's safe for everybody to do that. And so I guess it's you got to look at your situation and see if it's safe to do that too.
And what advice would you offer someone who just found out that they're an NPE?
Well, I, of course, listened to your entire podcast and I even found your podcast because I always say whenever anything comes up among my friends and family, somebody has done a YouTube about this. Somebody probably has I joke now.
Yeah.
Well, whatever it is, somebody's probably got a podcast about it. And so, I just immediately started Googling found out parent, or I don't even know what I put in there. And your podcast came up, and I was like, okay, we'll see. This is clearly not a rare occurrence, and there's a whole podcast about it. I would say, think about what helps you most in a crisis. When I am in a crisis, what helps me is have as much information as possible. I want to learn. It helps me to know that other people have gone through this. It helps me to know that what I'm feeling is not crazy. I know I did spend a childhood feeling that what I felt was not true, or that there was something that what I was feeling wasn't valid. And of course, it turns out I was right all along.
Yeah.
And so I would say, find out what's best for you to handle. Some people are going to have different coping mechanisms. And I think I would reach out to people that you know can be there to support you, because if you have coping mechanisms that are harmful, this might trigger that. But I would say listen to your podcast. I'm not doing a plug.
Thank you.
But I would, and I have sent it, I've sent it to my cousin, because I think hearing other people's experiences will really enlighten you, not only about what you're feeling and how to deal with what you're feeling, but also about how other people around you are going to react to this. And also the resources to find all this out, because very few of us would know how to find a detective, or what do they call them, DNA angels, to get more information and all that stuff. I mean, I never thought about any of that. So that's what I would say, is there's people out there who can help you figure out what you don't know. And I think that is the best thing. Look, you can say all you want to about social media and all the negative stuff about it, but the blessing of it all is, I say blessing a lot for somebody who's not, religious or spiritual, but the good thing about it all is it allows people all over the world to connect in a way that would have been impossible 30 years ago. And take advantage of that there's somebody out there who has gone through this and wants to hear about your experience.
Yeah.
I highly recommend therapy. It's great. If you can afford it, and probably your insurance can, if you have insurance, and that's a luxury. It is a luxury. But if you have it, use it and ask for that help. That's what I'd say. Ask for that help.
That's great advice. Well, Guy, it was such a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing your story. And I hope that things continue so positively for you. I think your outlook is so wonderful.
I feel very, very fortunate. Again, I can only attribute that to humor and being so old. There's a point at which, I always say, every decade there's a certain level of crap you don't care about anymore, and it just keeps getting better and better.
Thanks again to Guy for sharing his story. If you have a DNA surprise that you'd like to share, please email dnasurprises@gmail.com. Until next time.